So I'd like to introduce our moderator for this section. I really have to extend a really big thank you before I even introduce her, because our moderator was Dr. Bogenegger, who had a death in her family, so she could not be here. So I called on my good friend and colleague for many years, and just a phone call, and I said, Dr. McKay, I need your help. And she said, what is it? And that was it. So I don't often ask for help. When I ask for it, they know I really need it. So she didn't pause, she didn't blunder, she didn't say, let me check my schedule. She just said, what time? So I really want to thank her first before I introduce her. And I'm going to kind of read her bio, then I'm going to talk about her, because this is a woman I've known for at least 20 years, 20 plus years. So Dr. Cassandra McKay is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Student Services. Prior to her position as Associate Dean, she was the MSW Program Director at the Erickson Institute. She has a love affair with Jane Addams, having served actually on the faculty for about 18 years before going over to Erickson. And then a few years later, she comes back to join us as Associate Dean. And so we're really happy to have her back. Through her extensive career, she's provided compassionate and effective therapeutic services in a diverse setting of youth and families, including schools. Her dedication to supporting the well-being of young people and their families has really been a cornerstone of her professional practice. Dr. McKay's scholarly work is deeply rooted in critical social issues, including race and the development and analysis of school-related interventions, positive youth development, critical service learning, and youth voice are really key for her work. A recognized expert in her field, Dr. McKay has a robust record of publications and presentations. She's shared her insight, research, and practice experience both nationally and internationally, particularly on the profound impact of critical service learning as a powerful school social work intervention. Her work consistently highlights all of these interventions and how they can really shape the development of young people in school settings. So on a personal note, I've worked with Dr. McKay on a number of projects. I've known her since before coming to Jane Addams, so we won't start telling our ages here, but we've known each other for a long time. We have published together, we've written a book together, we have traveled internationally together to Japan, where we really helped to implement school social work practice there. She's just a dynamic person who is consistently the same. But most importantly, we often brainstorm ideas to each other about why don't we do this or why don't we do that, and we would just work to get it done. But 17 years ago, she co-founded the Training Institute with me, this very institute that's here today. And it's lasted for 17 years with not a lot of funding, without a lot of support, but with just the tenacity that it's the right thing to do. So it's such a nice pleasure to have her back here today. So Dr. McKay.
Always a surprise, but I am forever grateful. I am pleasantly just amazed by the robustness of this institute. Professor Johnson, you are way and beyond what we ever dreamed of in 2009 when it came about, right? Just a little bit of funding, And so I say this as a testament of just a seed. So do not despise small beginnings. Do not despise small beginnings, because you just don't know how it will grow.
I just want to say, the little Burst Magazine, we closed registration 3 weeks ago. Next year we'll have a big thing.
Right? You know, it surely was not like this at the beginning, but look at it now. So again, just my applause to Professor Johnson. This is just amazing. I am here today to operate as moderator for these fabulous folks here. Again, I need to just calm down a little bit. I didn't have any coffee today, so I'm good. But the idea of what has already transpired in the keynote presentation this morning, and what will happen not only right now, but then for the rest of today, you are just going to be blown away, and I'm just so thrilled by it. I'm joined by my colleagues and someone I just met, but Dr. Ray Eads and Dr. Daisy Diaz Strong, and then Gadi Gawami, okay, who actually is an alum, right?
I recognize you.
See, you know what? It's just amazing, an amazing day. And so we are joined here by beautiful and wonderful minds who want to not only share information that is near and dear to themselves, but also will have some time for conversation. And I'm going to give them the opportunity to say a little bit more about who they are and what they present, because I know, as always, we're going to run out of time. And if I stand up here a little bit longer, I'm going to eat into their time, so I'm not going to do that. But I do want you all to just get ready for what will be a very rich and robust conversation. And definitely, as you sit and listen, you know, do some thinking about, well, what are some of the questions that I want to engage in with them? Because my hope is that this is not just a lecture, right? It's a conversation. You came here for a conversation, which is a very critical thing, that we are not having conversations in the world these days. So let's have one today. All right. Whomever's next.
I'm Gauri Goswami. Can you hear me? I'm Gauri Goswami. I'm the therapy director at Children's Research Triangle, which is a nonprofit in the Loop. We provide services at our clinic, early childhood trauma therapy, and we provide in-school therapy on the South and West sides, primarily in Chicago. Before I had this role, I was, a therapist going into schools to provide therapy, and before that, I was doing home visits and stuff. So a lot of my work is very community-based. It's always been that way, navigating administrations that are difficult, navigating, families that are resistant to services. All of those things are things that I'm really passionate about, so I'm excited to talk to you about it today.
Hello, my name is Dr. Ray Eads. I'm an assistant professor here at the Jane Addams College of Social Work. I do research around strengths-based and holistic interventions and approaches for youth and family trauma. And I also teach our elective courses in the college on psychological trauma and mental health issues with children and adolescents. So some of what I'll talk about today is is content that I teach that I think is really important, but also informs the research that I do. So you'll get kind of a blend of my teaching and research interests.
Hi, I am Daisy Diaz Strong, also an assistant professor here at the Jane Addams College of Social Work. I come at this from a research perspective, and my research focuses on undocumented immigrants and how immigration policy affects their lives. Although I'm not a clinical social worker, immigration policy touches every part of life, and so certainly it affects their mental health and their sense of safety overall.
You can go first. Okay. All right. So we're going to start with kind of just our introductory statements, and then later there'll be some questions from our moderator and also questions from the audience. I kind of wanted to start off with giving us kind of taking a step back and look at just the way that we conceptualize trauma, and perhaps some ways that some of the leading ideas we have might not actually be fully accurate based on current research literature, or especially helpful when working with children and teens that have experienced trauma. So the idea I kind of want to put forth is that we often have a view of trauma where we're looking at an individual's memory of a past event that is very upsetting or life-threatening. And I would say if we take kind of the three parts of that, an individual's past memory, we could have compelling ways to say that each of those words is probably not fully accurate or not the best way of thinking about trauma. So just taking like the individual, thinking about trauma being something with individual, I don't think it's much of a lift for me to convince you that that's not a very effective way to think about trauma. Trauma and healing from trauma is all about relationships. So on the positive side of things, having good social support is one of the best protective factors against experiencing trauma. And healing relationships are a really important aspect of healing from trauma. On the flip side of that, we know that trauma is nested within families and family systems. It's nested within communities and society and history. So looking at trauma as individual to the person, which if I teach off of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it has a very much individual to the person's brain perspective, and there are a lot of limitations to that I kind of go over in my classes. So, I've done some research myself or conceptual work looking at a family systems approach to trauma and really thinking about how aspects of the family system are really important for perpetuating or healing from trauma. But even if we do think about the trauma that is individual within a child or adolescent, it's not necessarily going to stay within that individual. And what I mean by that is we know that kind of repeated exposure to the trauma of others, the stories of others, can lead to secondary trauma in social workers and teachers. And we also know that there's a lot of intergenerational trauma transmission. So I had about 6 years of practice experience working with adolescents with behavior problems, juvenile justice involvement, and behavioral health issues. And we often had adolescents that were already parents or were soon going to become parents. An important thing to keep in mind is, what we're doing now working with them is going to have impacts on their children and down the line. The other word that I want to kind of call attention to is thinking about trauma as something from the past. And there's, interesting ideas there. I think we can tend to think about trauma as something that happened in the past. Of course, we know that in our society there are many things going on that are causing trauma in the present, and having a history of trauma increases your vulnerability to further stress and adverse experiences. Applying the kind of intersectionality idea that Dr. Burnett Ziegler introduced, thinking about that with trauma, we can think about how individual trauma intersects with racial trauma, cultural trauma, historical trauma, and increases the vulnerability to new and future events. But one thing that is really fascinating, if you actually look at some of the research with the brain as it relates to trauma, is that it is not something that's in the past. If you do a brain scan of someone that is thinking about their trauma or going through a flashback, the parts of the brain on the right hemisphere in the emotional and fear centers are firing as though the trauma is happening in the present. So for that person, the trauma is alive and well in the present. The other thing, going back to the idea of intergenerational trauma, that is really fascinating from the last 20 years or so of literature, is research on how trauma can change the biology that gets passed to the next generation. And that really challenges some of the ideas that we have of genetics, of once you have your genetic code, it's always the same genetic code. That is true, but there's molecules that bind to your DNA, and that's impacted by the cell environment, and that's impacted by the social and cultural environment experiencing trauma. So stress, really significant stress and trauma that your grandparents experienced, could have affected the way that your genes are expressed, making you more vulnerable to stress and trauma in your life. And the trauma that you experience today could be impacting the biology that gets passed down to your children and grandchildren. So if we think about trauma as a problem impacting you, your grandparents, and your grandchildren, we can't really think about it as being just something that's in the past. It's something that we need to think about as being in the present and in the future, and to apply approaches that take a present and future type approach. The final thing that I want to kind of challenge is the idea of trauma being memory or memory-based. And this is really interesting because, we have some good interventions that work well when it is a memory problem. So if you have an intrusive memory that you can't get rid of, things like eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, trauma-focused CBT can be really helpful. They can help you reprocess that memory. They can help you retell the narrative of that story. But trauma is not always in the form of a memory. And trauma memory in general, it can be more fragmented and sensory than regular memories. And going back to the idea of trauma being the past, if the brain can actually see the trauma as something that happened in the past, it's not really a trauma memory anymore, because trauma shuts down the parts of your brain that sense and understand time. So once you can actually see that it happened in the past, that's kind of the after state of, okay, you had effective EMDR, or you had effective TFCBT, and now it's back as something that happened in the past. With trauma, and especially with children and adolescents and their trauma, is often much more of a regulation issue than it is a memory issue. So children are much less likely to have kind of clear and intrusive memories or flashbacks to a specific event. And if they've experienced trauma over many years of their childhood, it might be 100 or 1,000 events that have built up into that, and they have the problems with regulating their emotions, problem with regulating their behaviors, and problems in relationships, rather than a intrusive memory that they're trying to deal with. So it really kind of shifts our thinking if we think about trauma as a regulation problem rather than a memory problem for the children that we work with. And it may look different. Even when we're doing these required assessments and screeners, it might not be coming up as PTSD. If the fight-flight parts of the brain are firing in the present because the trauma is still alive in the present, that might be a kid with their flight response activated who's running around the classroom and can't stop, running around and looks hyperactive. Or their fight response is activated because they've had to, fight to protect themselves or feel like they're in danger, and that's showing up as fighting other kids or oppositional behavior, conduct disorder type behaviors. So with children in particular, we know that it's a broader range of symptoms that are more dysregulation in emotions, behaviors, affect, and relationships. But our diagnostic construct is still very much memory-based. And I teach in my class, I think, the PTSD criteria are too restrictive for children and adolescent trauma. And we need to think both in assessment and treatment in a broader lens, and be more creative in what we think of as even trauma treatment, which I'll touch on more later. So I will pass it on to Dr. Diaz-Strong.
Okay. I'm glad I made him go first. That was really informative for me. So as I mentioned, my research focuses on how immigration policy, specifically exclusionary immigration policy, affects undocumented immigrants. A lot of my work has looked at the experiences of undocumented youth and how it affects their transition to adulthood. But more recently, I've been looking at the experiences of undocumented women, AKA moms, and how that affects their lives, including their family lives. And so here, I'm also getting to see the context of how it affects their US citizen children. So I want to kind of talk about both a little bit today. So in terms of those who are undocumented themselves, who are foreign-born and don't have legal status here in the US, there's about 1.5 million kids under the age of 18. But then when we talk about those who are US citizens and who have a parent that is undocumented, those in mixed status families, we're talking about 4.5 million children. And from a trauma-informed perspective, we can really think about exclusionary immigration laws as undermining a core sense of safety in all aspects of life. We can think about it as having an impact through the lens of chronic stress, ongoing uncertainty, and also a break in social connections. So I'm going to talk about each of those in a little bit. But so a trauma-informed approach starts with understanding that it is a systemic issue, like Dr. Eads was saying, kind of moving out of that individual, right? This is a systemic issue, and it is ongoing. These immigration-related stressors become a part of life. It has been 40 years since there has been a law to create a pathway to legalization. So the women that I speak to, for example, have been living in the US for 25, 30 years, raising their children under the constant condition of uncertainty and fear. So There's some three key areas that immigration policy affects undocumented youth and children in mixed status families. One of them is financial hardships. We know that undocumented immigrants without the legal ability to work are going to be subjected to low-wage jobs, jobs that are exploitative. They're going to have a limited ability to have mobility, to move out of those jobs. So there's this sense of feeling stuck. And that's going to continue throughout their time in the United States. So that's going to, of course, impact the family because parents are going to be working these low-wage exploitative jobs, often having to work 2 jobs to make ends meet. And as our keynote speaker was talking about, these economic hardships show up in the school. There's also a challenge to having housing stability. Many undocumented immigrants will not be able to own a home. It's not impossible, but if they do, they have to pay higher down payments, higher interest rates, and so only a few are able to do that, which means that they're subjected to these higher rental costs and don't have a way to move out of that, and also just kind of not having that rootedness and that connectedness. There also are barriers to accessing safety net programs at the federal level. For most programs, undocumented immigrants are not eligible, despite what you might hear. And, in states, there's sort of differences. So for those who are undocumented themselves, they don't have access to these federal safety nets. For those who are U.S. citizen children, even if they're eligible, say for food stamps, because they're U.S. citizen children, their parents will often not take that up because they're worried that later on it might harm their ability to legalize their status. So there's a chilling effect regardless of citizenship. There's a huge emotional impact for those who are undocumented themselves. When they grow up in the US, in US schools, at first, they are told, right, that there's this American dream, that there's going to be this opportunity. And so they develop futures and aspirations that are aligned with their US citizen peers. But as they become adolescents and transition to adulthood, now they have to encounter the fact that they are not going to be able to work legally, that they don't have access to federal financial aid for college. And so it really becomes this jolting moment for them where they have to reorient all their beliefs about what life in the United States will look like for them, which you can imagine has a very negative mental health impact. They also begin to understand, as they begin to understand their legal status and the kind of rhetoric and stigma around that, they distance themselves from their peers because they're worried that their peers might ask too many questions, and then they might have to either lie to them about their status or face revealing their status and not know whether they can trust people. They will also fear school staff and be worried about whether they can trust in order to be able to tell you about their status. All of this causes many undocumented adolescents to withdraw socially, just at a time when social connections and peer relationships and support from staff is so important. For those who are US citizens, they're also growing up with this beginning understanding of their parents' contributions being devalued. They're growing up with this understanding that, wait, I might have to separate from my family in some way. They're growing up, if depending on the climate, that political climate sometimes makes its way into our schools, right? Our schools are these microcosms. So they might hear from their peers, oh, are your parents going to be deported? Or, oh, are you going to have to go back? This is a very common thing that I hear from both youth and the parents. And so they're also having to grapple with, I'm a US citizen, yet somehow my family is not being treated well. And so there's a second-class citizenship thing that they have to deal with as they're becoming adults. In all cases, undocumented youth and those who are US citizens are dealing with the constant fear of separation from family members or actually having to deal with separation if they've had a family member be detained and or deported. So there's just a sense of uncertainty within the family system. So you can kind of think about the whole family system as stressed in many important domains. And then there's the cultural part. We know that strong cultural connections are very protective. And indeed, I think that many of the youth and the families I speak to do have a very strong cultural connection. But immigration policy also affects that in a couple of ways. One, if you are undocumented, then you cannot travel to your country of origin, because if you do, you can't return. And so you're not able to go back to where you were born, to reconnect with your roots, to engage with your grandma, your aunts, your cousins. And so this creates this distance to transnational family members, and really like a feeling of you're told you're from this country, but it's a country you can't even go back to and really fully connect with. And then if you're a US citizen kid, you are able to travel, and often they do, and they go see their grandmas and their aunties and their cousins, but your mom and dad can't travel. I've heard from so many of the moms that they long to travel with their kids. Why, right? Think about like if you've ever traveled back to the neighborhood where you grew up with, and you show your kid, this is the house I grew up in. This is where my friends and I played. This is the places that I hung out with as an adolescent. You're connecting, you're sharing history, you're sharing tradition, you're sharing new memories and building that, and that's unavailable to them. There's also more recently, because of the intensified immigration enforcement, particularly here in Chicago, where people are afraid to go see family who lives too far. They won't go to Indiana, they won't go to Wisconsin, or even just travel, from Chicago into the suburbs. Again, breaking cultural connections, family connections. We're seeing people being afraid of going to cultural festivities and events. With the Independence Day events we had recently, some were canceled, there was less engagement, understandably. So these exclusionary immigration laws and the intensified enforcement, one key takeaway is it undermines the sense of safety. And what you can do, because I know this is very overwhelming, it's overwhelming for me, and of course we're limited in our ability to change these laws, but we can work towards building trustworthy relationships with young people and trying to build safer spaces in our schools, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. And a couple really important ways that you can do that is first get informed, right? You have to understand how these policies affect young people so that they can know that they can trust you. You can counter these anti-immigrant sentiments when their families' contributions are being devalued, when their right to be here in the US is being challenged constantly. You can say, hey, you belong here, your story matters, you do have contributions. You can make spaces to share that. You can do that vocally, you can do that with signs that say, you're welcomed here. And then you can connect within your community to know and understand the resources that are present, so that when a parent comes to you or a child does come to you and trust you with information, you then have resources that you're able to provide to them. So I'm going to stop there because I think I've gone over time.
Pardon me, I don't usually use microphones. So we've had, some really wonderful explanations and examples of what is trauma and kind of like the pervasive, insidious impact on people after experiencing long-term trauma, complex trauma, which is, I think, often the case for the students and the families that we work with. I want us to kind of conceptualize for a second what exactly that means for a child. I don't know how many people here work with older kids, like high school, middle school, versus younger ones, but just if we really think about it, most of the children that we work with have all experienced trauma before they even walk through the doors of their preschool, right? So when we're talking about trauma, they would have experienced that before you even knew them. So all these impacts that we're talking about have been taking place at that point over 3 years, 4 years, which is a long time when that's your entire existence, right? Does that make sense? So how this impacts kids is, that would be a whole institute day itself, right? But what I like to think about to conceptualize it a little bit is what questions come up for a child when they've experienced trauma? And a couple of big ones are adults safe? Often the answer is like, no, not really, or not all adults are. Are they predictable? Is my home safe? Is my environment safe? Do adults tell the truth? Because many kids, by the age of 4, know that they actually don't, right? So, if we think about it that way, then when a child walks into a classroom and the teacher is like, hey, sit down, turn your paper over, write your name at the top, those are all things that are not objectively that big of a deal. But when you feel like you are perpetually unsafe, that you can't trust adults, that there's nowhere, comfortable or good for you to be, that can feel like an attack, right? Or at the very least, an annoyance. Like I remember I asked a middle schooler something like, what's your name, what's your favorite color? Like rapport building, as they tell us to do. And he got up close and he was like, your face irritates me. And I was like, well, unfortunately for both of us, there's literally nothing I can do about that. So, here we are. So some of you may have seen, the impact of trauma kind of day to day. We see behavioral concerns, of externalizing stuff like acting out, aggression with peers, aggression with adults, difficulty being redirected. Transitions are a really big one, like going from a preferred activity to a not preferred activity. Even from like math to recess can be hard sometimes. Don't ask me why, What I think can also kind of be a danger zone is when there is no noticeable impairment. So you might see kids that are a little bit more reserved. They're super eager to please in a way that maybe makes you a little bit uncomfortable if you notice it, like almost like too eager, or rather than being kind of regulated, maybe they're restrained in their emotion, right? They're too calm. They're a little bit numb. Those are also signs of something going on. Which I bring up just because I think a lot of the time the loudest voices get the most treatment, So when you see a kid who's really not saying much, they could be quiet, but also they could be in a lot of pain, and we just don't know it. Trauma, of course, impairs functioning in the classroom, right? So we notice a lot of the time if you have a classroom population that's experienced a lot of trauma, then you have a classroom that is not really functioning. And I imagine, especially if many of you are school social workers, school counselors, then those kids all kind of get funneled to you. And it's like you cannot, in one session per week of however many minutes they give you, combat environmental trauma, systemic trauma, intergenerational trauma. That's just not realistic. And that's not even factoring in your own trauma. You know what I mean? We've all experienced something. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of time there's not a lot of room for that. And certainly not enough time or space or effort or energy. I feel even as a therapist doing one-on-one therapy, I don't feel like I have enough impact individually to combat the things that our kids deal with. So how do we do that? How do we kind of sustain connection in times of stress? And I think we can agree that this is a massive time of stress for everybody here, right? So I want to talk a little bit about co-regulation, which I think is used a lot, overused, some might say. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to functionally do that, especially in kind of like a crowded space when you can't really sit with a kid one-on-one for a long time. But I would like us to think about co-regulation as connection building. That's really what you're doing. You are a safe adult. We don't have a lot of safe adults. And so the most valuable thing you can do when a kid is freaking out is to be a safe adult. Even if you yourself are feeling frustrated, irritated. In the case of, me with the kid who said my face was irritating, a little hurt, a little confused. And so the step one is obviously to regulate yourselves, right? Take a breath, shake it out a little bit. If there is another adult who's available to take over for a second, it's okay to step out, take a few deep breaths, and kind of come back in. I know in my experience, a lot of the time, there are a million adults who run to the scene when a kid's freaking out, and no one really knows what to do. So now we just have a lot of loud adults in one space with a really loud kid. I remember seeing at a school, there was a 6-year-old who's, upset about something, and he zoomed out of his classroom, he zoomed to the counseling office where we were, then he zoomed all around the school, and everywhere he zoomed, he like picked up another adult who just zoomed after him. It was like out of a cartoon, you know? And I get it because you need to keep this baby safe, but then also it's like, are we really being trauma informed or are we panicking, you know? Panicking, we were panicking, you know? So co-regulation, you know, is basically warm, responsive interactions that provide coaching and modeling for the child. It requires us to pay close attention to the students around us and to respond consistently and sensitively. So consistently, like, you know, if you talk back to me one day and I don't really think about it, but the next day you talk back to me and all of a sudden you can't go to homecoming, that is not consistent. Now, yeah, I have contributed to your trauma, right? Like now I'm part of the problem. And that's hard because I don't feel consistently every day. And I imagine none of you do either, right? Where you are kind of like, you know, I've had a rough day. Maybe I had an argument with my own child before I left the house, and now this child is activating me. I get that. You're human. It's okay to make mistakes. But we want to aim for consistency as much as we can. Children are, especially young children, are dependent on adults to help them regulate. So warm and responsive interactions in early childhood are foundational for the development of that child's self-regulation further on. So if children learn that their needs will be met, they can relax and then begin to develop those self-soothing skills. So the basics of co-regulation. In therapy, we love like groups of 3. You know, we like to be like boom, boom, boom. It's not that easy, but I'm gonna do my best. So provide, structure, teach, and coach, right? So provide a warm, responsive relationship, structure the environment, and then teach and coach the self-regulation skills. So when we say provide a warm, responsive relationship, a lot of that is happening before the child is even upset, right? So with their first interaction with you, I am a warm, safe, responsive adult. If you bring a problem to me and it's annoying, and it will be, right? That's okay because I am a safe adult, so I'm going to hear that and validate that for you. In the moment when you're freaking out, you're insulting me, you're, you know, flipping tables and chairs, I am still warm and supported, even if I verbalize that I am frustrated. Structure the environment, so calm environment, quiet environment, whenever possible. Try to remove the loudness and the stimulants from the room. So in the case of my 6-year-old who was like zooming up and down the hallways, I would say out of like the 10 adults that were there, maybe 2 actually needed to be. So disperse people from the hallways, send people where they need to go. You know, keep it calm, keep it soothing if possible. Redirect the child into a space that is meant for that. You know, I know a lot of, it's harder in high school. I know a lot of elementary schools tend to have like quiet corners, calm areas, things like that. And then teach and coach self-regulation skills. This one I think is hard because anytime you tell, you know, a kid to take a deep breath or whatever, they're kind of like, yeah, okay, I'm not gonna do that, you know? Deep breaths don't work for me either, right? That's not realistic. So what I think does work, or can work, I should say, is to kind of narrate out loud, you know? So I know that you're frustrated, I would be frustrated too, or even I am frustrated. I agree this is unfair. I'm frustrated with the situation. I'm frustrated because I feel like you're yelling at me and I'm just trying to help you, right? Verbalizing your emotions and your response is a way to cue the child, even if they don't do it in that moment, to eventually do the same, which is really what our goal is, you know? I think sometimes, especially in a school environment or community environment, we think that the goal is to stop the behavior, but that is, I would argue more, it's less of the long-term goal. And the long-term goal is that eventually we don't have that happen anymore, right? So everything that we're doing in that moment, we want to make sure that it is facilitating our long-term goal of helping this child become a functional, happy adult. A good thing to pay attention to is, you know, a kid's cues. Like you can tell when a kid is about to ramp up, and kids can even tell you sometimes, right? They'll be like, well, she was irritating me, and then I started to get really hot, and then I punched her in the face. Or, you know, what one kid told me is, well, really, her head got in the way of my fist, you know? So when you see it happening, that's the time to intervene. I know a lot of the time we get called in a little bit late, like something has already happened and then all of a sudden you get like a call or a page or something and then you have to run over there. But whenever possible, try to intervene ahead of time. Help the teachers that you work with, if they are receptive, to recognize the cues in this child ahead of time so that they can call you ahead of time to intervene if they're not able to do so. When you do check-in, check-out with kids, as I'm assuming many people do, be proactive. A lot of the time during those moments, kids will be like, I'm fine, everything's fine, can I go, or they'll be like, can I stay with you? But there's no reason for them to stay, they just don't want to go to class. And so those are opportunities for connection, even if it's like a little bit silly, a little kind of like an icebreaker or something, you can get a lot from a kid, even when you're asking them something that does not feel immediately relevant to the crisis. Finally, we all miss the mark sometimes, right? We miss the signs, a kid freaks out, maybe we say something where, we kind of wish we hadn't, we were a little bit irritated, a kid is asking us for help and we kind of are like, not now, You're a human being, we're all human beings, we're all really trying to do our best. The repair is crucial. That's true in your personal lives as well, right? Like when we make a mistake with somebody, we say sorry. Kids are no exception. Kids are human. They deserve apologies. I know that these are all things that we know, but it's really hard to remember to apologize for upsetting a kid when that kid has like taken all the things on your desk and thrown them onto the ground, But they are deserving of dignity and an apology, and so that's the first place that we can start. When they reintegrate, let's say they've had a freak out and they're coming back into your office or they're going back into the classroom, we don't need to make it a big thing, right? In that moment, we can just say, like, I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you're feeling better. If they've left school for like a hospitalization or, some type of heavier psychiatric intervention, I'm glad you're back. Let me know if you need me. This idea that, like, I see that you experience something and I'm here for you and I want to be here for you can be really simple. And most of the time, that's kind of all they want. I'll stop here just so that we have time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to start the conversation, but as you all are sitting, and hopefully you've already done some of this already as far as think about questions that you want to bring to the presenters. We may not have time because I'm being mindful of our clock and what's been already designated as far as our hard stop, but we'll start here. So let me first start in the way that we began. So Dr. Eads, here's my first question for you. What are the pros and cons of solution-focused therapy versus problem-focused therapies for addressing childhood trauma? And the reason why I pose this to you, because always there's this new therapeutic model that hits the market. We need to use this is effective, but then again, we don't really know. So what would you say?
Thank you. And apologize. Thank you, Dr. McKay. I would say that solution-focused therapy is definitely an area that is close to my heart, and I do a lot of research in. And if you're not familiar with it, kind of the fundamental idea behind a solution-focused approach is instead of trying to understand what caused the problem as the first step in helping someone get to where they want to go, you focus on the life of the future they want to have once the problem is less troublesome for them. And I think sometimes with a trauma in particular, people can think of, well, they'll just say the trauma is gone or the trauma never happened, but you can still kind of frame it philosophically. It's like, okay, once the trauma is no longer as bothersome to you, what is it that you want your life to be like? What were some of the things you'd be doing, that you're not doing now? And kind of what's been seen in both the research and just kind of direct practice is that starting to do the things you would do once your problem is gone can actually help the problem go away. And in terms of pros and cons, I mean, certainly things like TFCBT, EMDR have more research evidence right now for their effectiveness than solution-focused therapy for trauma. I've done a systematic review on solution-focused therapy for trauma. There are a couple of good studies out there, but we need a lot more research. But from kind of a more philosophical or kind of theoretical standpoint, when we think about the complex trauma where there's not necessarily a clear memory, and maybe something like EMDR or TFCBT is going to be less helpful, if you're focusing on where someone wants to go, you don't need to know what the problem is. So you can work on build on the things that have already been helpful for that person, for that family, and build towards where they want to go, and that can have some of the same benefits that you want to see without having to know that there was trauma. And one other thing we know about the really heavy trauma-focused treatments is they can be intense, they can be uncomfortable. People might not want to do them. They might want to drop out of them. So even if you have a child that does have a specific trauma memory, they might not be ready to deal with it until they're in adulthood. But in the moment, you can still help them. Work on building on the skills that are already helping them, and do more of that, and more, move towards what they want to see in their life. And ultimately, that can be a more direct path than trying to understand what caused this really intense problem, because actually the solution might not look like the opposite of the problem. The solution might look like something completely different.
Thank you. Dr. Diaz-Strong. Let's find my glasses here. How might immigration policy affect the roles that you take on in the homes and potentially lead to adultification? We often hear this term, adultification, adultified child. So what does that mean, and how does that have an impact on the child?
Yeah, thank you. Well, like any family that's kind of stressed, children in homes, just immigrant families in general, but certainly undocumented immigrant families, often take on a lot of roles during childhood. And these start around the age of 8 or 9, so that's what the research shows. So why do they take on these roles, and what kind of roles do they take? Well, one, of course, is translation. So as parents are learning English or are not as proficient in English as the child, of course, they get called on to mediate interactions with a variety of institutions. So certainly the school systems, healthcare systems, even legal systems, young people have to translate. So I'll use my example. So I was 9 when I immigrated, and we came on a tourist visa. We landed in Florida, and then we're gonna take another flight to Chicago, but somehow missed our connecting flight. And so first day in this country, we're at the airport, lost, not sure what to do. And my mom's like, hey, you took English classes. Because like in Ecuador, we take English classes, but I knew how to say like window and door, but that didn't mean but she thought I knew more than her. So sure enough, I was trying to figure out, that was like my start at brokering. I had to figure out how to get a hotel, how to figure out what our flight would be the next day. That's my first memory of being here in the United States. And so, they also take on brokering at a financial level. They might help parents pay bills, particularly with technology now. And parents might not feel comfortable navigating technology, so they'll be helping parents do that. They will help parents with taxes. Again, I have a friend, I talk about this with my friends a lot. I have a friend who said, when I was a teenager, I helped my parents pay taxes, but I couldn't go to prom. Yeah, because their parents are still seeing you as a child, and they're still making decisions, right? Like, should you be able to go to prom? And they're like, no, you can't go to prom, but here, help me with my taxes. So there's like these roles, right? These kind of, so it's not, so in a way you are taking on roles, but parents are still very much being parents. So I think that example highlights that. But this puts young children in really difficult positions, because if you're translating at the doctor's office, you might hear very sensitive information about your parents' medical needs, and you might have to translate that. Also, you might see your parents be treated badly, negatively. being discriminated by the person at the front desk who, doesn't understand what they're saying because of an accent or, because of their language proficiency, then having the child have to come in and step in and say, how can I help? Again, I use my example. My dad still wants me to make phone calls, though he speaks English decently, but because of his accent, when it's very important, he's like, if they hear my accent, they're not going to treat me well. But if you call, they will treat you well. And I understand that, right? So I go ahead and I do that. So all of this leads to this sort of young children taking on adult roles that are more adult-like, and it can, both develop many competencies. They learn to interact with institutions. They learn to talk to adults, advocate. They learn to be resourceful. I can tell you, I have all of those strengths and skills, but it's not all positive, right? Because it's not it is over demanding for the age of the child. And eventually it does take a toll. It does create a tension in the relationships between the parents and the child when the child might not feel like they can go to their parents or they can lean on their parents, where they've had to be the one that parents lean on them. Again, the kind of tension between, I can't go to prom, but you want me to do your taxes, right? Kind of creating this conflict. So it's both can be a strength, and also it does create tension in the family dynamics that is long lasting. So I don't want to, romanticize any of it. But the reality is that families have to do that. So those of you who are in supportive roles, if you can include a translator, an interpreter, rather than depending on the child, healthcare systems, and I think this is happening more and more, having people at the front desk who speak languages other than English. If you can provide the resources to the parent, right? Here's resources for your taxes. Here's resources, immigration legal service providers. You can kind of help intervene rather than just looking at the parent and saying, well, don't lean on your child. You can be in a supportive role to the parent so that the child then isn't leaned on as much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take this and I'm going to direct this to Director Goswami. This came from the audience here, and then I know we had kind of pre-prepared some questions, but I'll get back to that one that I sent you earlier as well. But this question is, aside from regulation, how may trauma present in children with severe disabilities, specifically intellectual, developmental, and non-speaking individuals?
That's a really good question. I think like anything else, it varies. In my experience, especially for kids who are nonverbal, I think we see a lot of dysregulation. I was trying to find a different word so that, it wouldn't just be like that's the only thing we're talking about, but a lot of physical and emotional distress, a lot of difficulty, all the things that we see with children who don't have disabilities, who are verbal, we see the same thing, we just have less of a voice, right? So if you see a kid who's having a really hard time with transitions, where you see that they're, sometimes you can get a lot of like physical response, like a lot of resistance, a lot of like, leaning back, increased self-stimulating behaviors. I would say also the greater danger, at least in my opinion, is that they are not able to verbalize what the issue is. So you're doing a lot of guesswork. So what is the difference between your regular everyday distress, self-stimulation, whatever you might be doing, and a trauma response? And I think, unfortunately, without a lot of history, we don't always know because they can't tell us. But I guess that's where I would start. Like when you notice those physical signs of distress that do seem like I am upset, not just that I am, kind of not able to communicate. I don't know if I really answered that satisfactorily.
So I see that that clock is not right. This clock is, and we are unfortunately out of time. So I just want to thank you all for an amazing presentation. You all are in for treat after treat after treat. So again, just thank you for your attention, and we will continue on the conversation.